Welcome back to Global Semester, where we're all about becoming better cross-cultural representatives of King Jesus locally and globally. The following is a sermon I gave a few months ago at a church community where I shared how my family and I will be redeployed to Japan towards the end of the year. Hopefully when we get there, we'll have more on-the-ground application and Japanese culture-focused content. Anyway, what I shared at the church was that while our family is excited for this transition, there will be lots of new adaptations and challenges ahead of us. This places us into a posture of having to continue walking step by step, trusting, obeying, and discerning where and how the Holy Spirit is leading us. And that's really what faith is. It's obedience and trust and persevering by the power of His Spirit. And that's really what this passage in 2 Kings chapter 2 is going to show us. And hopefully this is the mindset that we enter into this passage in the story of Elisha. Now, before we get to the story, I'm going to give a brief overview of where we are in the story of the entire Bible. First of all, Kings is written down into 2 scrolls. It's actually one book, but 2 scrolls. They didn't have books back then, but they had scrolls. And you can only write so many things before the scroll becomes too heavy to carry. And the story of Kings is actually part of what's known as the Deuteronomistic history that starts with Deuteronomy, and then Joshua, and then Judges, and Samuel, and then Kings. Now Samuel is also written into 2 scrolls, 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. And then Kings, 1 Kings and 2 Kings. And this story of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings is written down with the lens of Deuteronomy in mind, because Deuteronomy is the covenant document between Israel and Yahweh. And this history is showing whether or not both parties have been faithful or unfaithful to this covenant document. And as we see throughout the story, time and time again, Yahweh has been faithful throughout this history, and Israel has been less than consistent in their faithfulness. And the story of Kings especially is the story that gives the rationale for the exile. This history was written to the people of Israel. And because this history was likely written down while the people were in exile, they were probably thinking, how could God forsake us? Has He become unfaithful to His promise? Why are we in exile? We were supposed to be in the promised land. We were supposed to be the covenant people of Yahweh. Why are we here? Why are we suffering like this? And so Kings is written down in the form of short narratives of how these kings actually led Israel down this spiraling degradation and disintegration of the nation. Israel was judged for 2 reasons. The first is that the kings led them to idolatry, following false gods like the Baals or the Asherah. And this actually led to the second reason why they were judged. They caused injustice in their communities, in their nation, in their land, because when they were worshiping Baal and other gods, those gods and their rituals required human sacrifices. In places like 1 Kings 16:34, the text alludes to a builder named Hiel, who built Jericho's foundation and gates at the cost of his eldest son and youngest son, respectively. 2 Kings chapter 6 alludes to cannibalism. And 2 Kings chapter 16 is more explicit when it says that King Ahaz made his son pass through fire according to the abominable practices of the nations whom Yahweh drove out before the people of Israel. And you see this throughout the kings, that they sacrificed people, and that was how idolatry led to injustice. That's why Kings gives the rationale for why Israel was judged and why they were in exile. Now, Kings is the story of how the kingdom of David was split into 2, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Time and time again, there's the formula of whether each king did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh or did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. For many of the good kings of the southern kingdom of Judah, there was also the tagline, as their father David had done. Now, why was David this kind of watermark for comparison for these kings? Well, the reason has to go back to 2 Samuel 7. In 2 Samuel 7, Yahweh promises King David that an offspring of his will build a house for Yahweh's name, and whose throne of his kingdom will be established forever. As you read the story of Israel, we get this question, oh, is this the king? Is this the anointed one? Is he the one who will build a house for Yahweh's name? Or we think, or as Israelites thought, that it was Solomon because, he built a temple in Yahweh's name. Then he dedicated the temple, and when he dedicated the temple, the presence of Yahweh filled the temple, as in 2 Chronicles 5:13-14. And so all was good, so they thought, right? Yeah, this must be the anointed king. This is the promised one of 2 Samuel 7. So he must be the one. But that was not the case. Because after Solomon's reign, the kingdom split into two. And it ends up that most of the kings were chumps. Each one collected Baals, babes, and booties, like their father Solomon did in the southern kingdom of Judah, or like Jeroboam did in the northern kingdom of Israel. And eventually, in the story of Kings, the northern kingdom of Israel were actually 0 for 20 of good kings, and they were conquered by the kingdom of Assyria in 722 BC, and they were led into exile. The southern kingdom of Judah, however, lasted a little bit longer, because they had 8 or so out of 20 good kings, but they were conquered eventually by the Babylonians in 587 BC. Now, why is this history important? Well, it has to do with the story for today, because in the story of Elijah and Elisha, and from now on, I'm going to be calling them Eliyahu and Elisha, because their names are significant. In the national story, the kings were leading the whole nation down to the ground, and it's almost as if you had a succession of trumps, and literally, they were like trumps. They were self-promoting, self-centered, they had questionable morals, and they led people astray. If you had a succession of leaders like Trumps, your nation would fall too. And so, in the story of the national history of Israel, we get these stories of people that God had raised up to meet the needs of the suffering of the people on the ground. Because of all of the foolishness at the top level of leadership, people on the ground suffered. And so God raised up prophets, messengers who confronted the leadership for their folly and evil and idolatry, but also people who ministered to the needs of those who were suffering. And so in the story of Eliyahu, whose name means "My God is Yahweh," Eliyahu's primary ministry was actually confronting the idolatry of the kings and of the people. And then his successor, Elisha, which means "My God is salvation," his primary ministry was to minister to the needs of people who were suffering and who were crying out to Yahweh. And so here's the main point of this passage, that in the midst of national crisis, war, famine, and injustice, the stories of Eliyahu and Elisha at the center of the book of Kings intend to show that God still hears and cares for the plight of the people on the ground. Eliyahu and Elisha serve as the promise from Deuteronomy 18 that Yahweh would raise up a prophet like Moses who would speak for God and who would deliver people in their crises, and who would remind them that Yahweh has not forgotten them and that Yahweh remains committed to his covenant promises to Israel. Eliyahu's and Elisha's region of ministry was in the northern kingdom of Israel, because remember, they were 0 for 20 of good kings, so they needed a little bit of help. So God raised up some good people who ministered to the people on the ground who were suffering. But even more so, in this chapter and in the stories of Elisha, we see key themes of what it means to live a life of discipleship, faithfulness, and perseverance. In other words, as Eugene Peterson would write, a long obedience in the same direction. We're going to go through this chapter through 4 movements. The first movement is the journey to the Jordan River in verses 1 to 8. And the second movement I call the audacious ask from verses 9 to 18. In the third movement, I called the Amazing Hydro-Man from verses 19 to 22, and in the final movement, in verses 23 to 25, I've called it Baldilocks and the She-Bears, and that will be the main focus of today's passage. So at this point, we see Elisha has been in Eliyahu's service for about 10 years now. We saw Elisha first called to the ministry of becoming a prophet in 2 Kings 19. And so he's been serving Eliyahu, learning from his mentor, doing menial jobs, and walking with him wherever he goes. So in this first movement, we have this journey to the Jordan River, and the story tells a pattern of 3. This pattern is significant because the story was meant to be memorized and retold in an oral culture where people, even children, could tell the story and remember it. The pattern of 3 is also significant because it shows that this was like a test. It was a test of Eliyahu's stick-to-itiveness, or his tenacity, that even though Eliyahu was giving him ways out to get out of the situation, Elisha knew that his mentor was about to be taken, and so he wanted to stick with him until the very end. Now we can reflect on this a couple of ways. 1, let's look at the geography. If you look with me on Google Maps, these are the possible locations of Gilgal, which is where they started. Beit El, Jericho, and the Jordan River. Now if we look even further and look at the topography, we see that they go from low ground to high ground, back to low ground, and then to lower ground by the river. Just out of curiosity, how long would it take to actually go from Gilgal to Beit El? And this is what Google Maps gives me. This is probably not the route that they took, but this would be the route if you wanted to hike it. It would take around 9 hours to go from Gilgal to Beit El. Now, if we were going to tell this as a contemporary story, let's say we had a senior or older pastor ask a junior or younger pastor to take a walk. The older pastor would say, well, God's calling me up to Grouse Mountain. You can stay here if you'd like. I'm just going to go there by myself because, it's a long journey. And the younger pastor would probably say to him, well, as the Lord lives, I'm sticking with you 'cause I'm made out of glue. Now remember, it's not taking a horse, it's not taking a car or bike or Uber or taxi, it's walking from Richmond up to Grouse Mountain. It would probably take them a whole day's journey, and they'd probably stay the night as they meet with the fellowship group there. The following day, or 2 days later, the older pastor would say again, I need to go to Metrotown. You can stay here if you'd like, but I need to go see another fellowship there, another group of Jesus followers. Then the younger pastor would go again, I'm sticking with you 'cause I'm made out of glue. Anything that you will do, I'm gonna do too. And so they head down to Metrotown, and they probably stay the night fellowshipping with the group there. And then the following day, or a couple of days later, the older pastor would say again, well, I need to go down to the Fraser River, and I'm going to go down Boundary Road. You can stay here if you like, or do what you want. Then the pastor would say again, I'm sticking with you 'cause I'm made out of glue. Anything that you will do, I'm gonna do too. And so they head down to the Fraser River, and then the older pastor would take his mantle and then part the Fraser River. And so that would be the journey. Now then, if I were the younger pastor, I'd be asking the question, couldn't we have just walked from Richmond to the final destination at the Fraser River? Isn't that closer? Why did we have to go all the way up to Grouse Mountain, all the way to Metrotown, and then back down to the Fraser River? And that's a good question, right? And so a couple of things come to mind. One is that this shows that the journey of discipleship is never ever just a straight line. Never ever just going from one place to the next. There's always ups and downs, zigs and zags before you get to where God is leading you. There's also a second reason why these places were significant. Now these stories were meant to be remembered, and they were meant to be retold and reflected on. And each of these places had significance in the history and story of Israel. Gilgal, where they first started, was in the story of Joshua 4, where Joshua and the Israelites crossed the Jordan. There they set up 12 stones in the riverbed to commemorate the 12 tribes crossing to the promised land. The second place, Bethel or Beit El. This is the story in Genesis 28, where Jacob famously dreamt of a ladder that led up to heaven and where angels, who had no wings, went up and down the ladder. The third location, Jericho or Jericho, in Joshua 6, where Joshua instructed the priests and the soldiers to march around the city 7 times, and in the 7th time to blow their trumpets, and the walls of Jericho fell down. And so from a pagan, animistic point of view, these were places of power: Gilgal, Bethel, Jericho, the Jordan River. These were places where God acted in significant ways in the story of Israel. And I think that's why there were schools of prophets in each of these cities. And that's why Eliyahu and Elisha traveled back and forth to those places in this story. And so the second thing to remember is that the journey of discipleship is a journey of remembrance. Remembrance of the times and places where God met with you and those around you. And the third thing to remember is the company of prophets, or the sons of the prophets that we met in each of these places, remind us that the journey of discipleship is a journey to train up new servant leaders who would do what you have been doing in serving Yahweh and the people. And so these are just some reflections on this first movement of the journey to the Jordan River. If you have other thoughts or things that you've reflected on, share them in the comments below. Now the second movement, the audacious ask, from verses 9 to 18. Here we see Elisha asking for a double portion of Eliyahu's spirit. Now what does this mean? Well, here are some possibilities of what they could mean. It could mean empowerment to perform power encounters. It's boldness to confront people of power. It's compassion to help the vulnerable in their midst. It's insight to see beyond normal sight. And it's endurance in this long-term ministry. And it's here that we see Elisha's first miracle after he saw Eliyahu led up into the realm of heaven by chariots of fire. And Elisha is left with the mantle or the cloak of the prophet Eliyahu. And he uses that cloak to do what Eliyahu did, to part the Jordan and cross it. But we'll talk about the miracles and the supernatural in a little bit. Also at this time, Elisha had a company of prophets, or in the Hebrew, it's sons of the prophets, which do not mean that they're literally sons, biological sons of the prophets. They were those who would follow after and learn from the prophets. And so part of their training, because they're meant to do the minor jobs of the prophets, was to remember the stories of the Torah, and to remember the stories where God had acted powerfully in their midst and among the people in the past, and to minister to those around them. And remember, Eliyahu and Elisha couldn't be in the same place all the time. So they had to have some people there who would help out in the community, who would meet the needs of the people there, and who would speak for God in those places. And so that's what the company of prophets, that's who they were. Now, you might be asking, who are these prophets and where did they come from? Here we need to remember the story of Eliyahu. In his deepest depression, he cried out to Yahweh saying, "I'm alone, I'm the only one left, and they're going to kill me." Remember that story in 1 Kings 19:14? Then Yahweh replies, "Okay, I'll send help, including Elisha, who will succeed you after your ministry. But know that there are 7,000, so not just you, who did not bow down to the Baals, and I have reserved them for myself." So it's likely that these company of prophets, or these sons of the prophets, came from this 7,000 who did not bow their knees to the Baals. And it is Eliyahu's and Elisha's responsibility to train them up and to speak for Yahweh and to minister to the needs around them. In other words, to do what they are doing. Now, at this time, Elisha did not yet have the influence or the honor amongst this company of prophets. You remember, he just became their leader after Eliyahu was taken up by the chariot of fire. And this company of prophets, in a way forcing Elisha's hand, says, well, we're going to go take a look for Eliyahu, okay? Is that okay? Is it okay? We can look for him. And Elisha said no, but somehow they shamed him. We can see that he doesn't have much of an influence in that community yet because they were able to shame him. And you're not supposed to do that. And in a Chinese church context, for example, the younger congregation, if they want to show honor and respect to their senior pastor, would never, ever, ever say this. They just don't do that. We don't do that, right? But that's exactly what this company of prophets did. And they did so because Elisha did not yet have the influence or the honor among this community yet. But he will. And so Elisha trains them by allowing them to make their own mistakes. And later in the story, we read that he does gain their honor. And he gains their respect and influence. And we see that the number of his company of prophets grows so much that they need to build an extension in their living quarters in the story of 2 Kings 6. And so that's the second movement of Elisha's audacious ask. And now we come to the third movement, the amazing hydroman in verses 19 to 22. And here we see the second of many miracles that Elisha performs. Now remember, Elisha asked for a double portion of Eliyahu's spirit. Now some commentators say that if Eliyahu performed 7 miracles or acts of power, then Elisha performed 14. Some say 8, and Elisha 16. Some say 11, then 22, or whatever it might be. The point is, Elisha gets twice as many stories of power encounters and supernatural works. Now, the other significant difference between Elisha and his predecessor is their main focus. Now remember, Eliyahu came to confront the idolatry of the northern kings of Israel. And Elisha, on the other hand, came to bring courage and comfort to the people who were on the ground suffering from the injustice, famine, and war. Now if you look with me, I'm going to list the differences between Eliyahu, his predecessor, and Elisha. And Eliyahu, whose prophetic marker, signature move, or shall we say his power move, is fire. He brought drought to the land for 3.5 years in 1 Kings 17. He did a fire challenge with the Baals on Mount Carmel in 1 Kings 18. And in 2 Kings 1, he burned 102 soldiers and captains with fire. Now fire in these cases were this elemental symbol of purification, judgment, and power. And we see Eliyahu, whose passion is for people to worship Yahweh, the one true God. And he lives up to his name, Eliyahu, which means my God, and Eliyahu means my God is Yahweh. Now when we look at Elisha, his prophetic marker, his signature move, is water. So in this chapter, we see Elisha purifying Jericho's waterline. We see him providing water for the army of Israel against their conflict with the Moabites in 2 Kings 3. Then there's the miraculous filling of oil for the widow, whose children were about to be taken by creditors as slaves in 2 Kings 4. And later on in 2 Kings 4, Elisha purifies the poisoned soup at Gilgal. In 2 Kings 5, Elisha heals Naaman's skin condition by telling him to bathe in the Jordan River. And in 2 Kings 6, Elisha makes an axe float on water. You see, water is this elemental symbol for healing, restoration, and compassion. And we see Elisha's zeal to bring salvation and shalom to people. And he lives up to his name, Elisha. Eli, which means my God. Shah, salvation. My God is salvation. And that's why I call him the amazing Hydroman. Hydroman, Hydroman, does whatever a prophet can. Heals the sick, raises the dead, purifies water whenever he can. Hey, hey, here comes the Hydroman. So when we get to this fourth movement, which I've called Goldilocks and the She-Bears, In just 3 verses, we get this really weird story. It's so weird that Jewish scholar Robert Alter writes this. This murderous response to the boys' mockery is morally scandalous. The early rabbis were so outraged by this story that they felt constrained to assert it that it never really happened. And it ends up being turned into an idiom. And the idiom is this: neither bears nor forests, which in one generation would also call it a cock and bull story, or in another generation, a tall tale, or in this generation, simply fake news. But I think there's actually a purpose for why this story is placed in this part. Now, stay with me here. If we make a comparison between the first chapters of 1 Kings and the first chapters of 2 Kings, in each there is a ruler on his deathbed. King David in 1 Kings 1 and King Ahaziah in 2 Kings 1. Then there's also a succession of leadership from David to Solomon, and in this part, a succession from Eliyahu to Elisha. Now, that's significant. There seems to be a parallel that the Hebrew writers want us to make, connecting Solomon with Elisha. And I think this is purposeful because Elisha's succession as prophet echoes Solomon's succession as king in the beginning of his kingship. If you remember, Solomon asks God for wisdom. This was his audacious ask. And in this chapter, at the beginning of his role as prophet, Elisha asks for a double portion of Eliyahu's spirit. Now, the next parallel between Solomon and Elisha is how at the beginning of their roles, there were already some shady things that were happening. For Solomon, his reign begins with conspiring and assassinating his dad's enemies and hiring forced labor to build his palace and Yahweh's temple. For Elisha, it's this scene with the mauling of the 42 young men. Then by the end of Solomon's reign, he accumulated babes, Baals, and booty, and he violates effectively every command of Deuteronomy 17 of what kings are not to do. He started as Solomon the sage and ended up being Solomon the schmuck. So this last part of 2 Kings 2 begs the question, is the prophet Elisha going to end up like King Solomon? Will the prophet Elisha be like King Solomon, who takes the mantle after a great leader, who asks for something audacious, who has some questionable things at the beginning and ends up finishing poorly? Thankfully, the answer is no. He doesn't end up like Solomon. We could say that Elisha, at the beginning of his ministry, had this murderous rage, if you call it, against these young men who were just calling him Baldy. But later on, we see that he grows into a person of compassion. Now, if you turn to 2 Kings 6, we see in this story that there were soldiers that were sent to capture Elisha, because he has been basically feeding information to the king of Israel. The Aramean king thought that if he could eliminate Elisha, then he'd be able to take over Israel. And so this Aramean king sends his soldiers to pursue and kill Elisha, but Elisha prays to God and basically they're blinded. And he leads them to the king of Israel. And the king of Israel asks him, okay, should we kill him now? Is that why you brought them here? But Elisha says no. What do you do if you capture soldiers? Do you not feed them as prisoners of war and take care of them and give them water? And so instead of killing these soldiers, he basically feeds them and cares for them and sends them back. So how different is that action compared to this earlier action of mauling 42 men and now saving this garrison of soldiers from death? So if we recap Elisha's ministry, in his 10 years of training, and in his 50 years of ministry as the Northern Kingdom's key prophet, Elisha lives a life of faithfulness, obedience, and perseverance. He continues this ministry of training the next generation of servant leaders, i.e. company of prophets. And in the midst of the narratives of kings, of how the kings of the Northern Kingdom of Israel and the Southern Kingdom of Judah have run the divided nations into the ground, Elisha faithfully continues his ministry of meeting tangible needs of people on the ground in healing and cleansing. And he lives up to his name of Elisha, my God is salvation. Then we shouldn't be surprised that the gospel writers portray Jesus as the writers of Kings portrays Elisha and Eliyahu. Jesus challenges the leaders of his day and calls people back to covenant faithfulness just like Eliyahu. And Jesus meets the needs of people who are suffering and people who are crying out, just like Elisha. And just like Elisha and Eliyahu, Jesus trains up disciples and brings healing and cleansing to people in need. Now, the gospel writers had a fourfold purpose for portraying Jesus in this way. They wanted to portray Jesus as the long-awaited faithful king, as the high priest or the righteous intercessor who would intercede for people, as the ultimate Passover lamb who would drink the cup of God's wrath for Israel's covenant faithfulness. And finally here, to portray him as the ultimate prophet of God, as well as someone who speaks for God, who challenges people to covenant faithfulness, and who ministers in supernatural ways to the needs of his people. Now, even more audacious is that Jesus promises that his followers, that's us, will do even greater things than what he has done, as he says in John 14:12, and that we would do this by the power and presence of the Holy Spirit. And that's why Jesus talks about the counselor, the advocate, this spirit that will come from him in John 14-16. And that this can only happen when we do good works together. And this idea of doing good works is not because we need to do them to be saved, but we do them because we have been saved. This is our responsibility. This is our role. This is our vocation. This is our call to the world to be the new creation and to keep walking in faithfulness. And so as we reflect on this story, that even in the midst of a national story of Israel and Judah, the stories of Eliyahu and Elisha show God's compassion for the families and the vulnerable in Israel. In the midst of this macro narrative, this big story, God is at work in the micro narratives, in the stories on the ground. Now, as we reflect on this in our day, in the midst of political leadership failure of the previous administration in the US, and among many high-level evangelical leadership, including superstar pastor Bill Hybels from Willow Creek, the Hillsong pastor Carl Lentz, and the prominent apologist Ravi Zacharias, that in the midst of all these conglomerate of clowns, God is still at work through the many stories of people showing kindness to others in the midst of a pandemic. God is still at work among God's people who are being intentional. And here's the question for all of us. Are we being available to be used by God to bring relief to others? Are we available when someone asks us for help? Or on the flip side, are we asking God or God's people for help when we need it? And the second takeaway is that it's important to take scripture seriously by remembering the stories so that when you're reading passages like 2 Kings and reading about places like Gilgal or Bethel or Jericho or the Jordan River, other stories are coming back to your mind for you to reflect on and see how God is speaking through these reflections. Scripture invites us to slow down, to reflect, to meditate, to allow these stories to seep into our innermost being, not only to see how these stories are interconnected or hyperlinked together, but also to recognize new insights that can speak to us in our day and in our circumstances. And at the end of this chapter, the authors of Kings challenge us to ask the question, is Elisha going to end well, or is he going to end up like Solomon's legacy? Are we going to end well, or are we going to end up like Solomon's folly? Yes, we might have blips and mistakes in our lives, but in the long run, are we going to remain faithful in what God has called us to be and to do in this world? We need to start thinking and having the mindset that this journey of discipleship is a long obedience in the same direction. in the direction of walking step by step by step with Jesus, trusting Him in obedience to Him and in response to the role that He's given us to minister to the world and to bring blessing to the nations. And we also need to have a mindset change that the big things that we do isn't going to be the big things that we do. There's a quote that says, "Our generation massively overestimates what we can do in the short term, but we massively underestimate what God can do through us in a lifetime of faithful service. One foot after the other, especially when we cannot see what's happening." So let that be our prayer today, that we ask for God's Spirit to fill us, that God's Spirit would encourage us and enable us to walk one step at a time, even though we cannot see what's happening, but trusting that in the long journey, in this long marathon of faith, in Jesus our King, and in our service to His kingdom, that we will make a massive difference, that we will be faithful, and that we will be tenacious like Elisha, and that we will be faithful and obedient and trusting. And so to summarize, what is the message for this morning, for this week, for this new year? In this passage and in the life of Elisha, I hope that we can take courage that even in the midst of this pandemic, in the midst of these scandals in leadership, in politics, and in the evangelical world, even in the midst of wars and suffering happening around the world, we can take heart that God has not forgotten us, and that God will meet us in our needs and in our suffering and in our cries for help, and that we are called to be God's hands and feet to help those who are crying out, to help those who are suffering from injustices and famines and wars and diseases. And in all of these things, God will enable us and empower us by His Spirit to be able to meet the needs of people across the street, or to be able to meet the needs and bring access to Jesus across the ocean to other nations. So let us be faithful people who will bring honor to Jesus, both locally and globally, as we live a life of long obedience in the same direction. And in this life of discipleship, faithfulness, and perseverance, may we, as we journey with Jesus, be able to sing that wherever He leads us, I'm sticking with you, 'cause I'm made out of glue. Anything that you will do, I'm gonna do too. May God bless you all. Shalom v'chesed v'emet, my friends.